Good morning to everyone. This particular block of training, I just want to give credit where credit is due, is not developed entirely by me. I did some modifications to it, but this I took from when the schoolhouse's website was developed by First Army a couple of years ago. And looking at it, actually, I thought they did a very good job of putting this together. So we'll begin with some of these words. Just a short video. Hey, can you click on that for me? That is, I think, a very good example from the Pearl Harbor of a triage situation on which many of us may have already experienced in our careers, and if we have not, hopefully we won't have to, but certainly there is very high likelihood that we could. So as far as this particular training is concerned, our main learning objective is really just to consider how we as unit ministry teams respond in a MASCAL situation in accordance with our guiding doctrine.
Chuck, I don't think your mic is on. Did you turn it back off, or you got a green light?
No green light, sir.
Okay, go ahead. You're good.
All right. Now, as far as the particular learning objectives that will enable us to do that, we're going to be looking at defining terms, of understanding the particular kind of layout of our SOP. Now, for what we have here for Medical Alaska and for Bassett, I brought our SOP, which is supposed to nest with the garrison, since Bassett will most likely be, of course, the primary treatment facility, assuming that it is not the source of the MASCAL. So that's something we can consider as well. And then finally, just for us to consider what specific religious support functions that we each do as chaplains and as religious affairs specialists as we engage in these activities. Looking at just some basic terms. Now, I know many of you might be familiar with this. It just kind of as an opportunity to refresh your memory. Different types of military treatment facilities. I think we're probably all familiar with a unit of tactical level medical care, your embedded medical providers, all the way down to potentially to platoon or squad level medics that take care of their soldiers. And then as we grow in size of unit, of course, the capabilities and the resources grow as well. We are fortunate here at Fort Wainwright to have a pretty robust, medical facility. It can't do everything, and we are somewhat limited with trauma response, but also very intentional, even though we don't really do trauma response as part of our normal day-to-day medical operations, but maintaining that skill level for our medics and for our doctors and different staff there, so that if anything like this ever did occur, we could work directly with FMH and medevacing down to Anchorage and that sort of thing, really make sure that we can provide that immediate level of care here and to help get people where they need to be. All right, so this is just basic definition of a mass casualty. I'll give you a moment to read over that. Somewhat ambiguous. What do you think it means by any large number?
Anything that overwhelms the local logistical support capabilities.
Absolutely. If we're talking squad level with one medic, then a couple of casualties, right? Now, does that meet the basic intent definition of MASCAL? Probably not, but it's very similar in how they're going to have to respond to that. There's still that medic on the ground with multiple casualties, and he's the only provider, is going to have to triage, right? He's going to have to assess who he or she needs to address first. It's also going to have to look at some other considerations. What do you think in that very kind of small, low-level tactical situation? What other things might that medic need to consider?
Who can he actually help?
Who can he help? Okay, that's good. We need to know kind of who's savable, basically. We can make that determination. What else?
Just medical supplies and resources.
Yeah, supplies and resources, and the ability to resupply. Absolutely. What else does he need to consider at that tactical level? What about some of the training that the other soldiers may have received? Right? What are some examples of that? What do we receive as military, basically all military personnel, or most anyway? What are some of the trainings we receive?
Combat outfit.
Yeah, combat lifesaver course, basic first aid, CPR, that sort of thing. So it may be that the person who requires CPR, that is the focus of the medic. However, most of us are probably trained to do CPR. So it could be a matter of assigning that to someone else who can do it while you go and assess others. Some of the things that, at least just practically, that I've learned, mostly just from combat experience as well as experience in the civilian world, is that people who look like they're the worst off in the moment, may not actually be. So we have to take the time to assess. So paying attention to the person who needs CPR, but not paying much attention to the one who's bleeding out from, internal injuries. We can't see it. Blood isn't, it's pooling inside, that sort of thing. That's why we need to all step up and do what we need to do in those situations to free up the right personnel to be able to make those assessments. What about a facility like MASCAL? What are some examples of things here that can happen in Fort Wainwright that might overwhelm us?
Got an airfield.
Yep.
So you
An
can
airfield.
MASCAL in the airfield.
Aircraft's taking off and landing, even if it's not just a potential, crash, victims, but also the collateral of damage that could happen if the plane crashes into a barracks building or something like that. Anything else?
An earthquake.
An earthquake.
It impacts
Yeah.
the whole city.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Something as simple as a bus turnover or accident or even a six-pack Humvee,
Yeah.
could overwhelm.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So we're looking at triage, and again, I'm not going to read the slides. I'll give you a chance to read over this. So we're looking at the concept of triage. This is just a bit of background on where the term came from and how it's come into popular use. How many of you have ever been a part of a triage type of situation? Do you mind sharing?
They had it processed so well, it was during my first rotation in TCK. And it was a really good.
Okay.
But, by the time we started building them, I didn't have to take much part in it. I was right there, but, since I had already crawled blocked with my medics, MASCAL SOP and embedded it with Taxoff. It's incredible afterwards, we didn't lose anything. Even though we had one that mining slept on it for some.
Thank you for sharing. Anyone else have any firsthand experience? I had one in the very first time I remember being in this type of situation. It was actually prior to the military. I was on a trip to Israel with my family, and there was a car accident where 5 nuns. The one driving had fallen asleep. She had a heart condition she wasn't aware of, and it caused her to fall asleep at the wheel. She veered off, and the light posts or whatnot, they have very large concrete bases that hold them, in the very loose kind of soil and sand, especially there on the West Bank where we were driving through. And anyway, all 5 were very severely injured. So my family was really the only ones around. There were no other cars that were driving by. So we stopped and were trying to render aid. We were worried that the car was going to slide off into this deep ditch. So we tried to get them out of the vehicle. Finally, there was another local man that stopped and was able to call for medical assistance. But here we had 5 people who were extremely injured, and we're looking at how do we try and render aid as best as possible. This is another example, though, of one where we thought she was already dead, was the driver, or extremely injured. She was the one who was actually the only one that ended up surviving. The other 4 passed away. The driver was the only one who ended up surviving. There may be some opportunity to talk about that a little more in a moment. But that's the very first one I remember. Just the idea of only having a few people to render care, and really having to look at that and say, okay, where can we best be useful? Why is it important in situations like triage to train as we fight? I know you mentioned NTC and kind of the MASCAL procedures that you had practiced and trained on prior to, and how that was beneficial. Why do we need to train as we fight?
Well, part of that is peaceful minds. A few other times in this last second time, you're not embedded well with your medics with not just a written MASCAL SOP, but doing some sand tampling, crawl, walking. By the time it really hits for real training or a real event, their expectations will be that you're expecting. And that may not be, definitely probably is not necessarily the only replacement for effective measurement.
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, we'll talk about this. It'll come up a little bit later, but arguably that's not necessarily where we need to be, especially with a lot of the medical abilities that we have today, capabilities that we have. Oftentimes, those who are considered expectant are unconscious, so they're not really able to receive much pastoral care. Not to say that there's not things that we can do, that we should do. It just may not be our top priority. So looking at triage categories, again, things I don't think that I'm necessarily unfamiliar with, from a medical point of view, expectant, is the least priority. I'm not going to put a tremendous, that's the point and purpose of triage, is not to, and I use this word with caution, but we're not going to waste resources, basically valuable resources, on someone who can't be saved by them, at the expense, potentially, of others that could be. Now, what about these bottom categories, psychiatric and whatnot? Why are they considerations?
One of those.
Because, for example, when I was here at Florida, I was working at the hospital when the 9 soldiers got drowning on the training exercise. We had more issues down in the family staging area than we did kind of at the scene and anywhere else. So I think out of everybody, most of the captains were in those 2 areas more than anywhere else when everything was going down there. So
Absolutely. You know, from a medical point of view, they're not going to be the top priority because we're not talking about life, limb, or eyesight type of issues here. However, from a religious support point of view, certainly that can be where we're, if not most needed, you know, certainly right up there.
Bodies are the only thing.
Absolutely. And I think another, you know, as we consider the nature of being overwhelmed in those type of situations, and going back to my question of why we train as we fight, you know, what did you notice from the video clip? Was there a lot of emotion, you know, involved in these situations? Chaos, right? Fear, anxiety, you know, worry on the part of, you know, of the providers, as well as, of course, the patients. What happened when they saw the nurse that they knew? Did that change their, you know, their demeanor a bit? They did what? Yeah, the one stopped, definitely the one stopped working, absolutely. Now, we consider small communities like, you know, Fort Wayne right here. If something were to occur, chances of us knowing someone pretty high. Right? We have to be prepared for that. So we train repeatedly on these things so that when we're in the midst of those intense emotions, we can still get the job done because it's a job that needs to be done. Often, too, with all of the emotions flying into chaos, some of the internal, you know, internal meaning, you know, psychiatric or spiritual wounds, those can often go overlooked because we're so focused on the pressing need.
In some ways, that's where you're going to have, to use your comment from earlier, you could end up wasting resources. And I don't mean it that, you know, it sounds horrible, but connections with that actual battle scene.
Mm-hmm.
What they ended up doing was taking the soldiers and staging them separate from the families because they didn't know when, where, how. And so at that point, you start thinking as a religious support team member, how do I minister to the families when I'm supposed to be down here with my soldiers too? When are we going to go? Where are we going to go? How quick is that going to be? And it was a couple months before they started figuring out what are we going to do with the battle.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, one of the, I think the key components that comes up as we talk about this is the idea of team, right? Of a teamwork approach to these type of situations. There may very well be, you know, times where our one unit, local unit, you know, battalion level UMT is the only one present, right? So you as a team still figure out how best to utilize your internal resources. Often though, you know, we may find ourselves in a situation where there are an entire group of UMTs, multiple UMTs, different levels of experience, you know, certainly different rank structure, that sort of thing, where we can have a more disciplined and intentional approach to how we do ministry in these type of environments. Do we need every chaplain coming around, you know, with the expectants? Probably not. Right? We can divide and conquer in that sense of utilizing our resources most effectively to include paying attention to those who are dealing with the more, you know, internal, spiritual, emotional type of woundedness, and certainly with the families. Well, some of the other considerations, casualty evacuation. We're all familiar with the concept, just movement of casualties using non-medical assets. That is kind of the first, usually the first response in many of these situations. In a combat environment, of course, that could be the vehicles that, you know, that are part of a convoy or whatnot. Could even be a non-medical, kind of a tactical, you know, air support, helicopter, that sort of thing. What about here? What might we see? Is it always going to be ambulances? Can it always be, depending on how overwhelmed we might be?
Well, from a Fort Greeley perspective, our MASCAL tends to be greater since our resources are even more limited.
Mm-hmm.
So
Absolutely.
we would depend on medical helicopters, choppers to come evac our series up here in Madison.
What about, you know, POVs, things like that? Put them in the back of the truck, get them to the hospital, that sort of thing. You know, there are times when we have to improvise. Again, depending on the actual source of, the disaster of the whatever it may be, of the mass casualty, if it is in a place that renders, some of the actual medical evacuation equipment useless. They hit the ambulance area here at Fort Wayne, right? We don't have those really, so we make use of whatever we have. And oftentimes you'll see that, certainly we see it dramatized in movies of, trucks rolling into the, to the ER with someone hurt or injured in the back. We get people to the casualty collection point as soon as we possibly can, because that's where they can be triaged and that's where they can begin to receive the care that they need.
And speaking of collection points, yeah, always make sure you know where they are.
Yeah, okay.
They have typically that on the.
No, you're not. So the basic concept of a casualty collection point, just like it sounds, it's a place that the casualties are collected so that they may be assessed, right? So we know where to send them. What are some considerations in a CONUS environment like this that might go into such an assessment? What are they looking for at a casualty collection point? What are they trying to assess?
Space to triage,
Okay.
egress, ingress, the tactical environment, force protection.
Yep. So here, what are they looking at? We have, say, 10 casualties come in to Bassett. What are they considering?
You're still looking at priority. What priority are they in that scheme?
So what priority for treatment? What else? There you go. What can we do here? Who needs to be medevaced out? Right? So it can be difficult to make that decision with casualty spread, all over here, for instance, all over Fort Wayne, right, or all over a particular battle space, or if it was an attack on one of our bases. It's challenging to make that decision because you can't necessarily determine which casualty from this side of the base is, how they stack up compared to one over here, just based on, on radio reports or phone calls or that sort of thing. So having them collected in one place so that we can determine, we have one helicopter going down to Anchorage, who needs to be on it? Who can we keep alive here? Not to say that they, 2 or 3 need to get there, but who can we keep alive here longer while they wait for that chopper to get back? That's So, looking at unit SOPs, why is it important to know what your SOP is, to know that it's updated? Why do we have why should that be a concern of ours? You know what to do. Okay. When we consider AR 165, it does not go into extreme detail about MASCALs. In fact, it only really comes up twice, other than just defining the term. Once to say that the chief of chaplains will ensure that the chaplain corps basically is integrated into larger disaster response mass casualty procedures. But then also at the unit level, right, the tasking to each chaplain that it's really our job to ensure that we are integrated and nested into what's going on within our particular unit. So what's some of the necessary first steps for us to ensure that that's actually the case? Yeah. Read what? Which SOP? Yeah. Now just stick with the religious support SOP that's in the OIP book or whatever that you inherited from, the chaplain 5 years ago. Start by, because when you consider from a UMT perspective, does my SOP, does my religious support integration into MASCAL operations SOP, does that need to be updated? The considerations there are, has, say, Garrison's SOP been updated? Has the local hospital, right, has their SOP been updated? Has my particular unit's SOP been updated? Because if your SOP is tracking an entirely different casualty collection point or an entirely different procedure for finding out where the casualty collection point is, then you may show up somewhere and wonder where everyone else is. Knowing which chaplain is in charge is an important thing. It's not the time to worry about rank, it's not the time to worry about, experience and all of that. It's really, again, emotions are running high across the board. We don't necessarily know who's going to be available, who's going to be on leave, which one of us might be a part of the casualties. And so identifying kind of who we're turning to for direction, who's going to be making the call for which chaplains go down to the family staging area or the family holding area, which chaplains are going to be with the expectants, and which chaplains are going to be with, just those that we're looking at for potential emotional or spiritual injury, that sort of thing. It's an important concept to at least have in our mind as we enter into those situations. Like with most intense environments, we don't want to figure it out in the midst of it.
And also, those unit SCP should probably be nested in the ATP 1.05-11.
Absolutely. So we have to make sure that we know that we're doing what, the chief of chaplains expects us to do, right? They're kind of nested within our own course doctrine and standard procedures, and then take that and apply it locally so that we're not operating out of sync with what everyone else is doing. So are any of you familiar with what is likely to occur if, say, we do have a large scale incident here at Fort Wainwright, and Bassett is indeed our primary provider of medical care. They're not, we're not too terribly damaged. What is the casualty collection point? Does anyone know that? Casualty collection point here, first choice anyway, is the emergency room. Right? The emergency room at Bassett. The ambulance bay outside of it, if necessary. So if there's more casualties than can actually fit inside, and that is a heated space outside that people can be brought to and triage with an easy egress point for those who need to be medevaced out. We have a helipad, of course, at the hospital that always is kept clean, snow and ice and that sort of thing. There's also kind of a backup as well that's right near that casualty collection point, just in case of situations like this. So, one of the things that can happen depending on the size of the disaster, and especially as we consider things like earthquakes, is that our cell phones, right, may not always work. The network could be overwhelmed, could be turned off, might not find it, any number of different things that could occur. So knowing where to go, whether you're on duty or off duty or whatever, knowing where to go to make yourself the most useful part of the team is certainly, I think, something that we all need to consider before something like that happens. And the casualty collection point, because if you don't have other orders already, then that's a good place to start. So this is just a small representation of what a combat-oriented or a tactical casualty collection point might look like. It's not working. You can see the little ambulance over here on the side. Right? The triage point is the large T here over on the right-hand side of this diagram. You can see the different levels of triage there with delayed, immediate, minimal, and expectant. And then different treatment possibilities inside of this tactical treatment center. And then the evac options. Right? Now, of course, here it would look a little bit different, but it's the same basic concept, no matter where you are. What are some of the considerations? Restricted access to treatment areas. What would those restrictions, what could they be? Self-imposed restrictions, would we have any of those? We're going to let anybody and everybody roll into the ER at Bassett if it's a MASCAL type of situation. What do we not want?
Chaos.
Exactly. We don't want a lot of husbands, wives, mothers, fathers searching for their loved ones in the midst of trying to keep people alive. Right? So there's going to be some self-imposed restriction. We don't want a bunch of reporters coming around. We don't want, unnecessary people. What about some potential restrictions that are not imposed by us?
So before you move on, your comment about unnecessary people, there may be leaders on site that feel as though a chaplain is unnecessary evil.
Absolutely.
So that's, a point to consider.
Well, and there are times when chaplains behave as unnecessary people. So on one hand, I would say if it's a uniformed leader, then that's, and they believe that we're unnecessary, that's probably our fault for not ensuring that they're tracking our SOP and that it's nested within theirs. Within every unit SOP, there should be some mention of religious support. Right? If not, then I would say we're not doing our jobs as staff officers. They're probably not going to just do that on their own. Right? So when we look at it, if it's not there, we don't just create our own SOP and stop at that. It would be good for us to kind of create that connection. So there is that expectation. Right? And you don't always have to do that at every level of command, but we certainly need to make sure that those who are likely to be in charge of such situations, that they're tracked. And that's another good reason to train as we fight. Because, again, we don't want to be figuring out where we're supposed to be in the midst of this very chaotic and potentially emotional situation. We also don't want the leaders on the ground, whether they be medical staff or commanders, trying to figure out how to utilize this or to put us what to do with us in the midst of those same situations. Because we are not the priority, nor should we be. Right? That is not a decision that they need to be thinking about. It's a decision that should have been made and practiced many times before we find ourselves in that situation. What about some of the other considerations here? The need for decontamination. Where might that come into play?
If you go to war with North Korea,
Yeah. Any type of chemical, biological, weapons that could be used against us.
and one thing that your really snazzy graphic didn't show, and it's probably just too much detail, but if you are in a seabird environment, you will have ambulance routes that are clean routes and dirty routes.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Why do we have the physical separation of each category? Each triage category.
That way, if someone is suspecting dies, someone can make it, they don't do that.
Yeah.
Like, oh my God, he died. No.
That's part of it.
Reduces confusion on the part of providers.
Yeah, absolutely. Reduces confusion. Reduces kind of that emotional response that, would be likely. Any other things you can think of?
Just creates a more efficient way of getting everyone needed to the area.
Yeah, exactly. It's lots of considerations, space considerations, right? More room for providers to move around in areas where they need to move around, that sort of thing. There's potential contamination issues. We want to keep groups separated so that there's not kind of cross-contamination, especially if they're coming from different places. That's a potential consideration. What is a factor, an environmental factor that we need to consider here in Alaska?
Weather, temperature.
Right? There's not a whole lot of places in the world where that's a real issue. I mean, it's an issue of comfort. We certainly don't want someone out in 25, 30-degree weather, when they're sick or injured. But that's really more a matter of comfort. We keep them from developing hypothermia. We can put blankets and whatnot, and that sort of thing. Here, when it's -20, -30, -40 or below, really it gets even colder, I think, at the coldest points in the winter. Now you're thinking about any exposed skin at all on that person for any period of time, especially if there's reduced blood flow and that sort of thing. We're talking about then creating an opportunity for further injury. So again, when we consider getting people to the casualty collection point as quickly as possible, here, that consideration certainly, I think, has a higher priority than it might elsewhere. And also making sure that there's space at the casualty collection. If Bassett was overwhelmed, we can't just choose a nice open field, that sort of thing. We've got to consider things like heating and, space for helicopters and whatnot to take off and land, that sort of thing. All right, so religious support to a mass casualty situation. This is where we look at our core competencies as chaplains. To nurture the living, to care for the wounded, and to honor the fallen. So before we move on to the next slides, how do you think we do that? How do we do these? How do we engage with our own core competencies as a chaplain corps in a MASCAL environment?
Nurtured living is caring for the care providers appropriately when they're not trying to save lives.
Yeah.
And the families.
Care providers and families, okay?
Even the unit, like, one of the soldiers part of the MASCAL was in proclamation, there's somewhere else.
Yep. Absolutely, absolutely. So for those who are impacted, maybe indirectly by this event, talking about caring for providers, what are some considerations there? What do we need to be thinking about?
Even, don't try to think outside the box, if you will. Even like ambulance drivers.
Yep.
Folks who are transported.
Absolutely, absolutely. Is this the time, if they're in the midst of an intense kind of triage situation, is that the time for us to come up and start offering emotional, spiritual support to doctors and nurses, medics?
No, but you
Probably not in kind of in a direct sort of way. What are some things that we could do though?
Just a quick hand on the shoulder or back or something,
Yeah.
just let them know you're there.
Yeah, absolutely. But paying attention to things like, do they need water? Right? And also for myself, even I find myself doing this when we've done some of the MASCAL exercises at Bassett, kind of taking my chaplain pose of, watching, where do I need to interject myself, that sort of thing, as opposed to, grabbing a litter and helping carry. Sometimes being an actual help, taking blankets to people who need blankets, that sort of thing. We're still doing our job in that. Again, it depends on what's happening. You don't want to be so busy doing those things that you're not providing religious support, but you can do both simultaneously.
There's a few of us gray hairs who grew up watching Father Mulcahy.
Yeah.
I'm going to want to jump in.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And there's times too, going back to my time at BAMC, which was much more trauma-oriented, of course, than Bassett is. But there are times when we can actually be of use to the medical team, just by helping to distract someone. I remember a 16-year-old boy that was shot in the leg by a stepfather. And as they're trying to just clean the wound, me holding his hand and giving him a hand to squeeze as he's screaming as they're doing this, that was helpful because it helped to keep him focused and calm. As calm as a person could be in such a situation. As opposed to just interjecting myself in the midst of everything going on, being just another body in the way as they're trying to move around. Figure out where you can be useful and don't wait on them to tell you, because for one, they probably won't know, and you're not their priority. Right?
Can I ask your thoughts on the previous slide question? So in the honor of the fallen,
Yes, sir.
one of the things, since we had talked about the Seaburn environment, most of us currently serving and those coming up really have never experienced casualties in the hundreds or thousands that our forebears did in World War I and World War II in Korea. And so I know that the last time I was at JRTC, our brigade actually really kind of scratched our heads and thought hard about what do we do in a situation where we have to do a mass burial. How do you chaplain in a situation like that? Kind of rediscovering that for our core.
Absolutely, absolutely. Often in those situations, there's so many more practical considerations. It's a matter of how do we take care of those, surviving? How do we honor the desires of those that we're burying, and also how do we honor the fallen? I think also as a way of nurturing the living. We want want to make sure that we're giving honor where honor is due, so that those who remain behind feel like they've done their part. Any other thoughts on that type of scenario? Anyone ever spent any time diving deep into that? That's not one I really ever thought about, so it's a good point to bring up. We should. All right, so let's take a moment to read through this. Okay, what do you think this means? What do you get from this slide?
You need to have an alert, attentive, religious affairs specialist.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Be a force multiplier.
It's a team effort. That's the part that really stood out to me. We have to work together as a team, and we discussed that relative to multiple UMTs, right, and dividing and conquering a situation like this. But also, I think that holds true, for the local level UMT as well. The chaplain making kind of the initial assessment of knowing where their team needs to be, kind of what the priority of effort, should be. But then also allowing, enabling, and encouraging the religious affairs specialist to do what they're trained to do as well. What does it specifically says? To then moves ahead of the chaplain to determine where the chaplain should be next. For the couple of religious affairs specialists and NCOs in the room, what does that mean? What does that look like practically? What do you think that looks like?
It's a recon, right? So
You're the older guy.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right.
So yeah, it's recon, it's a needs assessment. Not just on their own, talking to leadership.
What are they reconning?
So I guess
What are they reconning? What are they looking for?
in a MASCAL situation, variety of things. Could be anything from soldiers who are dying, who maybe require traumatic event management, who experience loss of a close friend, fellow buddy. Maybe they have like a moral crisis, where they, like, where's God in this type thing.
Yeah.
Maybe there's could be.
So I hear a lot of opportunity to assess and look for things that maybe others might not really have the time to focus on. The opportunity to look for some of those, especially emotional and spiritual injuries that that everyone else is focused on the guy bleeding out over here.
We train as we fight, so we do a lot of command post exercises as a brigade, and getting to know people before this kind of thing happens is critical.
Yeah.
So what I want my religious affairs specialist to do is go talk to the meadow that she's talked to a million times before and say, okay, this is where we're at. Where do you see you need us?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Those relationships before he and this kind of thing.
Absolutely. Well, imagine too, you've got, say you are ministering to the expectants, right? Those who are expecting to die. You've got 20 of them there, and there's only 2 chaplains. Are you just going to go down the line? Is that the right answer? I mean, it's an answer. Is that what you do? You just go down the line, one to the next? Maybe have that religious affairs specialist or NCO going through that room as well and determining which ones, they're all expectant, but expectant doesn't mean they're going to be dead in the next 5 minutes, right? But some may be. Some may be dead in the next 5 minutes. Some may have 10, 15, 20 minutes. So as you're looking to your priority of efforts as the chaplain in that room, probably somewhat emotional and overwhelmed in that moment as well, then you don't want to have to waste time looking around the room to figure out where you need to go next. You need someone there who can tell you, sir, over here. this person needs you next. When you're done here, I've got a person over here that you need to get to. Right? That's coordinating that effort. Do you have time to leave the room to go ask for more chaplains? Say it is a large group, there's multiple UMTs present. Probably not. Right? That's not the best use of your time if you're already overwhelmed and needing extra help. So having someone that can go and do that, be, I think a very good idea. What if you're anointing with oil and you run out of oil? You've got to, again, depending on where you are in the situation, but it may very well be that your assistant knows where you keep those things, right? Knows where your supplies are, knows what supplies to have on hand in a situation like this. They can pay attention to what level of supplies is there, so that they can anticipate needs and make sure that they're met before we even know anything. Best case scenario. Best case scenario for a worst case scenario. All right, spiritual triage. What do you think that is? We talked about medical triage. I think that's a little bit easier to understand. What is spiritual triage?
Figuring out how to best treat each one spiritually.
Okay. So what are our spiritual treatments?
Prayer.
Prayer. Okay.
Sometimes anointing.
Anointing. What else? Counseling. Yeah. And that's a part of it, right?
For some non-believers, just
Yeah. Just being present. A calm, non-anxious presence, preferably.
Depending on your denomination, your certain rights
Mm-hmm.
you might need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Who knows some of the religious traditions who, need to receive or desire to receive things like last rites? Roman Catholic. Wow.
You're an Episcopal as
I was
well?
gonna say, I hope I don't end up in that situation. Me too. Yeah, Anglicans too. Yeah. Anglicans, Episcopalians. Who else? Yeah. I don't know that we'll have a lot of chaplains that can provide that, but
You're going to have some Jewish and Muslim personnel that will have the prayers.
yeah, absolutely. Just on the Christian side as well, Orthodox, right? Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Anglican, Episcopalian, all have really the same, last rites type of scenario. Now, if it's an Orthodox person dying, you don't have an Orthodox priest. Here, we don't have an Orthodox chaplain. Right now, we don't have a Roman Catholic priest either, but if it's an Orthodox priest or an Orthodox person dying, can the Roman Catholic chaplain provide last rites to that Orthodox person? Yeah, absolutely. It's an Anglican dying. Roman Catholic priest can do that too, as can an Orthodox. So it's a matter of, we don't have to know every little detail about every religious tradition, but it is good, as we're considering these things, to at least have some basic awareness of what each particular tradition needs. And as part of, especially I think this falls into the lane of the religious affairs specialists and NCOs as well, of coordinating that care. Right? Of seeing these are the needs in this immediate area, and we know we've got this resource over here. Do we want to use our Roman Catholic priest, ministering to families, in the family waiting area, holding area? Is that the most useful place for them? Probably not, depending on the situation. Not that they're not adequate family counselors and good at, at helping to mitigate, kind of that emotional type of situation, but that's just probably not the most sacramentally useful place for them to be. All right. What other things do we look for in spiritual triage? Anything else? It's very important. Mm-hmm. Level of panic, okay, yeah. What about this last bullet point here? Oh, sorry. Last bullet point here. That was my fault. I had the right slide. Does anyone know what that DD 1380 is?
The chart.
Yeah, the chart sometimes, or the card for a MASCAL type of situation, it usually gets pinned on to the person. There's something that we can look for there, right? Is documentation that chaplains have already seen that person, especially if they're unconscious. So you're stopping and spending time praying. Now, granted, if there's the opportunity, if there's no one else for you to, to minister to, then certainly it's never going to hurt anyone to get multiple prayers. But if that person, that group of people have already been visited, have already been seen, then you may be needed elsewhere. So paying attention to what's already been done. I do want to go back just to touch on this.
If I have stickers, I can mark on it.
Yeah, you thought you should always put a cross on there. Why would this, and again, this is slides generated by First Army. I kept it in here because I agree with it about 80%. The priority of effort to the immediate versus the expectant. Why would that be our priority? Am I alone in thinking, at least when I first read this, am I alone in thinking, oh, our priority effort should be to the expectants as chaplains? Does anyone else think that?
No.
I believe yes and no.
Mm-hmm. It's usually a good answer.
I would say yes, and it's one of the because they were doing
Yeah.
not be fully aware or able to provide all of this stuff that you do expect those kinds of situations, but they're more than able to provide any others that is to continue this.
Yeah, it's a complicated one. So I think there's a sacramental consideration, certainly. Now, an unconscious person can't necessarily receive Mass rites. They can be anointed, but there's multiple elements of that are not necessarily going to be able to participate in or to receive. What about the Protestant side that he's talking about here, or the non-religious even, or the non-Christian who are religious? If they're conscious, if they're able to interact, I wouldn't stop or even, even essential, perhaps, to their spirituality in that moment.
There's something about, when we talk about the priority of effort, that we're not necessarily including the quantity, not quality, quantity, okay?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't mean that it goes back to your earlier thoughts about spiritual triage and also just where do we need to be?
Yeah.
Where the superior specialist can say, okay, this is great, now get over here.
Yeah.
I mean, do this. I found that in that last, I've only done one real one and a few trainings, but it was incredible was spending the time with the medics and surgeons and the training that when that really happened. It was easy to go to point to who they were feared for the most, but that they didn't expect to stay there.
Yeah.
And neither did we.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then that way we're able to, yes, it's a priority, and making sure that if there's a sacraments need to be advised or anointings or special administrations. But if not, and then once taken care of, immediately go, because there comes that part from religious support that's still the ounce of prevention.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that as we're looking at spiritual triage, that's a key component. It's not just about who we're going to go to first. It's about how much of our resources are we going to exhaust on each individual person or in a group. So looking at time, probably as from a religious support standpoint, time is most likely going to be our biggest resource consideration in a situation like this. How much time can we spend? Is this the time to spend an hour comforting a family member when there are people dying in the next room? I can't necessarily answer that question standing here nice and comfortable. That's a question we've got to answer on the ground there, considering what resources we have available to us. Do we need to spend 10 minutes with each dying person who's unconscious and can't hear us? Potentially there's considerations there. Maybe they can hear us, maybe they can't. We won't know that though, as they're saying. Now, we don't know if they're fully brain dead or just unconscious, or we don't know what's going on. We don't have access to that information in those situations. Do we spend 10 minutes in comforting prayer with them? Or do we simply, anoint the sign of the cross on their head and say, Lord, have mercy, and move on to the next person? That's something that we have to assess in that moment. And that's part of what spiritual triage, I think, is really all about. Earlier, I made mention of the reality now that most of because of the medical, capabilities, that at least in a situation like this where we've got a hospital to provide care, we've got potential air medevac opportunities, we've got another more trauma-oriented hospital in town that can assist us. Those who are going to be counted as expectant are probably going to be unconscious, or at least very minimal, level of consciousness. And so, when we consider where we're going to get the biggest return, for our investment of time, where we're most needed, it may very well be with the immediates. All right, so here's an example of that DD form 1380. We don't need to spend a lot of time on this. There's the front and back.
Where does the chaplain write?
In the notes section, and do not write too much. You don't need to, really, beyond the fact that you visited. If it's a Roman Catholic chaplain and you're a Roman Catholic priest, then you might write last rites, or whatever. Chances are you probably are going to be the only one there, but there may be others. Other than that, you don't need to tell us everything you did, just that you visited. All right, visited by chaplain, just chaplain. Again, that's kind of one of those things that if it's possible to coordinate, either with the senior chaplain on the ground and a particular environment, depending on where you are, it's probably going to look a little differently, or with the senior senior medical personnel who are going to be potentially calling that. Maybe the senior religious affairs NCO on the ground, just to say when they're visited by a chaplain, we just write CH in the bottom corner. That keeps us out of the medical personnel's way, but it communicates to the medical personnel this person received care. Why would that matter? Even beyond the situation. Of course, it matters for us managing resources in the moment, so we don't want to pull a chaplain from across the hospital or whatnot if someone's already been seen. But why does it matter later?
Good to show we were involved, we were there.
It shows we were involved in there, yeah. What else? Any other considerations?
Family might be good for the family to know.
Absolutely. I told the story earlier about the car of 5 nuns that were in the car accident. 4 of the 5 passed away. The 5th one was, injured very severely. It was in the hospital for months. They were all part. If any of you have ever visited Israel, visited the Holy Land, there is a, I can't think of it now, but where Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount, basically. There is a convent up there, and a chapel that you can visit. Well, these were nuns visiting from that particular convent. And we were able to, from the one that was somewhat conscious, we were able to figure that out. And so we were back in that area a few days later, and we visited that convent to speak with them, because we thought maybe they would want to know, just kind of the details of what had happened. And the thing that they were the most concerned with and most happy about were, one, that their sisters didn't die alone, right? They died with other Christians that were praying with them. But also, little things like we gave them water, right? So they had a drink of water before they died, that sort of thing. Like that was really probably the most impactful thing, was that we gave water to 2 of them that were conscious. We gave them water. They cared more about that than anything else. All right, so for that Roman Catholic family, or the Orthodox or Anglican family, knowing that their soldier, their family member, or whatnot, received last rites, that's going to be important. Knowing that they were just not alone, that they were prayed with, right? They were, that there was a chaplain that cared enough to pray with them. That's meaningful. And these things do get kept, and the information on them, things like that, does get passed down to the family. So our operations during a MASCAL. Why would we need to wear PPE?
Because we're the only chaplain who get taken out.
Absolutely. What can take you out?
Words, chemicals.
Chemicals, yeah. What else? Are gloves PPE? Where, if you're dealing with patients that have open wounds and that sort of thing, one, you don't want to cross-contaminate. We talked about that. Especially, if you're dealing with the expectants and you've got gloves that are, covered in goo and blood and all that stuff, and you move over to, say, those who are immediate. Well, take the gloves off and get new gloves, right? Because you're protecting the patients and you're protecting yourself. Don't just go in without gloves if you can have them. And again, this is all situationally dependent, but it should be a consideration because we're looking to how do we take care of ourselves in the midst of situations. Threat level. Who's probably going to be most concerned about threat level in our group here? Yeah, our religious affairs specialist. Absolutely. So there are times when you may not be the one who can go ahead of the chaplain and figure out who they need to visit next because you're providing necessary protection or augmenting, hopefully, others that are doing as well. The additional UMTs who should be ready. Is that something that we can determine ahead of time? How would we do that? SOP, okay. Who's SOP?
Unit's SOP is nested with the garrison SOP, which should be nested with the hospital's SOP.
Yeah, and maybe USARAC as well, and some others, right, in this particular environment. But making sure that they're all nested together so that we know who to call and how to call them, and that they're expecting that, and they know what to do when they get that call. Making sure that we do a little bit of just planning and training as we expect to fight in those type of situations. Don't just limit it to what you do and how you integrate with medical personnel. Consider how we integrate with higher echelons of UMTs as well. Any questions, comments, concerns, fears, worries, or doubts?
So have we ever practiced MASCAL with any of the local hospitals and buildings?
Well, we've practiced it with Bassett twice since I've been there.
So how many level 1 trauma units do we have in our area?
FMH is our closest with any type of real trauma capacity, and they are somewhat limited as well. I don't know that they classify as a level 1, that I'm not sure. Most major traumas get immediately evac'd to Anchorage, even from FMH. But they may be, I'm not sure what their actual classification is. They certainly have greater capabilities than we have, especially in terms of things like ICU care, that sort of thing. We're looking at the potential involvement in CONUS location of children and babies. Bassett does not have an NICU, that sort of thing. FMH has limited capabilities, but better than we have. And then, kind of it goes from Bassett to FMH down to Anchorage and then to Seattle and beyond.
So how would Fort Wainwright get on that rotation to have that MASCAL training here?
Well, the hospital has those trainings scheduled out throughout the year, at least one per year, if not more, but at least one per year. This is part of our SOP. Now, as far as engaging with the greater, kind of Fort Wainwright community, I think that is just a matter of coordination. And really should be something coordinated, not directly by us, as much as, kind of MASCAL operations for Garrison and re-nesting ourselves within that. I know Fort Wainwright has done MASCAL trainings, at least within the last 12 months. It doesn't always necessarily include like the full MASCAL, we're taking casualties into Bassett. Sometimes it's just how do they respond here on post, different organizations. But looking at having an integrated training where we, you know, we do nest ourselves appropriately within what's going on around us. It's a good idea. It's just a matter of finding out when those things are happening. All of that should be published, and Fragos and whatnot ahead of time is just looking for us and responding to them. Are we included in them, for one? And if not, it's probably an indicator that maybe some of those SOPs need to ensure an appropriate focus on unity involved.
I just wanted to point, I mean, this is a great conversation. We were talking about the same stuff at 425 and we're down at JRTC right now. And Chapel 4, we're really great about covering down for each other. Hey, I need some help, I need a problem, it's all good. So we just got to remember that SOPs don't have tacit authority.
Yeah.
Right, so to make sure that the religious support plan is nested within tab D of the annex, and that's integrated into what the unit's got going on, and the chain of command is actually on board with what our religious support plan is, because take your, squared away SOP to the command, like, hey, it's my cycle. 3 shots not tracking that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where, you'll often see, like with that tab D and whatnot, it'll say something like, MASCAL response in accordance with unit SOP. Or we will provide memorial services or whatnot in accordance with, unit SOP. The SOP is a necessary first step. We need to know what we're going to do in those situations, but it is not the only step needed to actually coordinate response. Very good one.
Well, when we're dealing with a full-scale exercise and like that, we're looking at all of it. There are places that chaplains may be needed other than the trauma center.
Oh, absolutely.
So when we gained this with the EOC, really we kept our chaplains were on post, and then they had chaplains that were integrated in the community that already did those kinds of things. So we didn't have to repeat, we didn't have to overlap. We were doing our thing because there's places here on post, depending on whatever happened, the chaplains.
Yeah, absolutely. And for our last MASCAL exercise that Bassett fully participated in, which means the entire hospital then is now focused on that exercise. We are treating it as though it was an actual mass casualty, potentially appointments canceled, that sort of thing, so the providers can focus on that. I received a call from Chapel Park very early on just to say, are you adequately staffed to meet this need, which we were, especially for training purposes. But that call was a necessary call. I would hope and imagine the expectation also that if he couldn't get me on the phone, that someone would actually show up to assess that. If we have, say, 30, 40, 50 casualties coming into Bassett, I'm probably by myself. I'm not going to adequately be able to cover that. But we don't need every chaplain on Fort Wainwright or Bassett either. Just having 1 or 2 to augment, care and coverage there, while others are then strategically deployed throughout, the larger environment, taking care of our staff and personnel, as this typically is a very wide-ranging type of exercise.